My name is Don Mahoney. I'm battling getting over COVID last week for the second time. Doesn't seem quite right, does it? And I'm gonna measure my voice slowly this morning to make sure that I have something left by the time we get to the end here. So, we are an organization, BGW is an organization that is built on the idea of two primary principles: stewardship and ministry. And I'm going to explain throughout the morning how the process reinforces those two concepts. The reason that Pastor Matt has been involved with BGW is because we had an inordinate number of ministry groups come to us and say, boy, we have been up the creek, we've been fighting inside the church, we've had battles as far as leadership, as far as this thing and the next thing. And we realized that people were not properly preparing themselves for a building project. When I was a student, and it's been a while, I'm 40 years out of graduate school. When I was a student beginning in 1979, I worked for a couple of my professors, and they did large custom homes. 3 out of the first 5 custom homes that I worked on ended in divorce before they opened the doors to the house. And the reason is because they had bad marriages that they thought a custom home could solve. They would go into these projects thinking, you know what we need? We need some shared adversity. And they would start in on the process to get a home designed, and when the myriad of decisions would come along that required them to work together, to go through the process together, to compromise together, they were unable to do it because they had the wrong foundation for the process that they were about to endure. And the same thing happens with churches and schools as they start the process thinking, you know what, we've got all these structural issues with the church or with the ministry that we're faced with here. If we just had a little shared diversity that we could rally our people around, we can get a project built, and that'll solve our problems because we'll pull together. Maybe, probably not. Probably we're going to fracture the whole thing apart. And so Matt spends an awful lot of time on story calls with organizations to make sure that they are prepared to enter into this process so that they don't go down the road and put at risk the spiritual challenge that the Lord has put before them for their communities. So it is an important part of our process to really assess. And that's an important part of the process of stewardship, right? Stewardship is basically counting the cost. And counting the cost is a biblical mandate. I mean, Jesus told a parable about counting the cost. What man starts a project and doesn't go out and count the cost of the project to make sure that he or she is prepared to be able to do this? So it is very important for us. And if we all get on that same page and understand, is the church properly prepared? Is the ministry organization properly prepared? We have a much greater chance of success. And then as we go along, continuing to take steps to count the cost properly. And that's a hard thing to do in today's economy, particularly in Central Texas. Counting the costs in Central Texas is a moving target. The costs here, this marketplace for construction is as active as any place in the nation right now. And it's hopefully flattening out, but we'll see as time goes on. It's been a challenge. So I'll tell you a little bit of personal history too. I've been doing this now for 40 years since I got out of graduate school. For 20 of those years, I spent time in my own office. I had an office for 14 years, and my specialty was getting involved in performing arts work. That's what I spent a lot of my time on. I did some churches. I did probably 10 or 15 churches, including my own, the one that I was saved in. We did that building in 1989 and 1990, and I go into that building today. I no longer attend there because I moved out of the community about 2 years ago and moved up to Ogden, Utah from Salt Lake City. I go into that building and I just put my head down about all the stupid decisions that I made when I designed that building. The inflexibility, the unexpandability of the building, the rigidity of the building. We live in an earthquake zone. I think that we could have a major earthquake and that building would roll down the hill and hopefully land right side up and be totally intact because it was built so rigidly. It was built all out of load-bearing concrete block walls. But as ministry has changed, as things have altered over time, and we needed to start making spaces function in different ways, I found that the buildings that I was first involved with, the buildings that I was trained to design from people who were trained in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, all of those buildings were very non-functional suddenly. And we would go to make changes in them to accommodate the way that people minister to one another right now, and it was very difficult, very difficult. And so I learned some lessons along the way in that time period. I was partnered to an individual who was coming out of HOK Sports out of Kansas City, and Craig Elliott, his task in life was he was doing community centers, but he was doing community centers in a very modern, contemporary way, not like the old YMCAs of the past. He was doing community centers that were buildings that were alive, large central gathering space. We're going to talk about what third place is this morning when we get into some of the design aspects, but spaces that people can come into, that they're received into, that they can see inside, that they can come into, and they can be incorporated into the context of what that building has to offer. They can see, that's not the door to the locker room to the pool, but there's 50 feet of glass to the pool, and I can see activity in there, or the gymnasium, or the running track slicing through, or the climbing wall is all right there. So a very generous view of the way that space can be presented so people can become acclimated to what a building has to offer. And I found it interesting as time has gone on that now we're designing a lot of our buildings along the lines of a modern community center, taking some of the principles that were designed for people gathering in communities and bringing that into the design. So I've had an interesting background of learning how not to do churches that were inflexible and rigid and unexpandable and dark, institutional, protective, to buildings that are open, that are a different kind of building. And you can see it actually on this campus. You can see the older style of building next to us that's more formal, more iconic, and a newer type of building. So we'll talk more about that as we go along. It is important to set the right foundation for any project. And for that, we need to ensure the fact that we are establishing decision-making along the way in a way that makes sense. That is, getting to a point where we can establish a building committee. Sometimes the building committee, actually we had one the other day come in and say, we said, how large of a church do you have? And they told us about 1,200 people, pretty good sized church. And we asked them, how big of a building committee do you have? And the pastor said, we have a building committee of one. You're looking at them. Okay. To be honest with you, that's my dream project. I have one person to answer to. Every question that I have, I can go to that one person and say, what is going on here? But I can pretty much assure you that going down the path, there are going to be some challenges to that. That there's an awful lot of risk to a pastor to do that. So sometimes we would advise that a committee be established that allows people to integrate into the project, if for no other reason, to protect the pastor, to make sure that the pastor is positioned in such a way that they can provide input, but they're not the main target of whatever is coming along. Matt mentioned that we've done something north of 1,000 projects in the last 22 years. The vast majority of them have had representation from a building committee. Sometimes those building committees are put together well, and sometimes they're put together in kind of a ad hoc format that doesn't make a lot of sense. I want to give you some of the things we've learned about putting a building committee together. First of all, when you do this, get the right leader. Get a leader. Make sure that there's structure set up for the building committee, that somebody has the ability to take a leadership position, and that they're a person who is going to bring it to conclusion. I can't tell you how many times we've gotten involved in projects where people enjoy the process so much that they don't want to see it end. And it goes on and on and on, and it seems like we're going through a loop. You seen the movie Groundhog Day? It's like we get up every morning and redesign the different aspects of the building because the process has been so enjoyable they don't want to see it end. Bring a leader who will lead. And leading implies progress. It implies that we're going to make some decisions and we're going to move from A to B to C to D to get to where we need to go. There are people who know how to do that, people who are respected. If you don't have a good leader, you're going to have a hard time even getting the project up and off the ground. It's going to be difficult to get things moving forward. So for us, the main thing is getting that leader. Ideally, it's not the senior pastor. The information gathered from the senior pastor is critical. They probably have done more thinking on this than anybody else connected to the ministry. They may not have as much experience in actually getting the building built, but it is important to have the perspective of the senior pastor involved, but not necessarily somebody who is leading that effort. You need to have somebody who is respected by the rest of the people in the church, that is known to the rest of the people in the church. Don't bring an outsider in. We've seen groups make the mistake of hiring what they call a CM, or a construction manager, who comes in, who will chair the building committee and go ask various individuals, but they don't understand the culture of the organization that they're trying to lead. So somebody who is going to lead, who understands how decisions have gotten made in the past, what are some of the hindrances, what are some of the boundaries, what are some of the tripping hazards along the way. And that person who has confronted those things has to be a person who has demonstrated success in overcoming those things, who has the respect of other individuals. Somebody who's going to be mature in their faith. Somebody who gets the core reason why we're doing the project and can explain it from a faith standpoint. There are going to be points along the way where we're going to ask individuals to step forward and explain, maybe it's to a group of subcontractors, who you are and why you're doing the project. In 3 sentences, what's going on. Who can be succinct, who can come into a situation and be able to explain exactly what it is that they believe and how this project is going to benefit their internal community and the external community as well. Give the committee a defined objective. Oops, I skipped one. The last one I do want to comment on. Somebody who can bring out the best in all the other members of the building committee. So a building committee is not put together to look good for the church. A building committee is put together to make sure that different opinions are represented and different perspectives are represented when the process is moving forward. And so they have to be able who can decipher what the qualities are of each of the people on the building committee and allow them to allow their gift to flourish, so to speak. We'll talk about how to put those people together in a minute. Give them a defined objective. Don't just tell them that you're trying to create a building and give them some general guidelines and send them out on a mission. Ask them to write it down, to put a written communication down that gives everybody a clear understanding that you can look back to. I'll tell you one of the reasons why that's really important is because as time goes on, our average project is typically 4 years from the time that somebody says go to the time where we open the doors. That's average. So that means that there's projects that take 3 years, there's projects that take 6 years. I've had a project that took 12 years to come to bear. When you work in places like Southern California or even Northern California, and you go in to say, how long is it going to take us to get this zoning approval, they'll just look at you without blinking and tell you 2 years. And to be able to have the ability to keep on course with what it is you're trying to accomplish during that time is crucially important, particularly as people start to move away. People will be on your building committee and suddenly they're not there anymore, and you've got to find a replacement. Give them that written objective on what you're trying to accomplish so that you're not starting over again. We've had the problem where the people that are forming the building committee, they'll say, well, we've committed this building committee for the next year and a half. A year and a half comes along, they still haven't started construction or even construction drawings, and all of a sudden they're onto something else. A new committee comes in and says, no, we want to rethink all of these decisions, and you're back to square one again. So it's important to write these things down so that there is an embodiment of the memory of what it is that you're trying to accomplish. Give them a defined end objective. A lot of times when we go into a charette, it is not, and I'll describe what charette is in just a little while in our next segments, but when we'll go into a design charette, it is not unusual for us to find out that the budget doesn't actually sustain all that they want to accomplish. So we have to have a viable phased approach to getting the project built. If we design a beautiful building or a beautiful project, but it never has a hope of getting built, it's been a mental exercise that has been a waste of everybody's time. And in those situations, everybody loses credibility. The building committee loses credibility, the leadership of the church loses credibility, the architect, those that are involved in the planning of the project lose credibility, particularly if you start raising money on something like that and then you decide, well, we can't really afford this project. So give them a viable, phased approach towards getting the project done. And that ought to be defined pretty clearly early in the process, if not during the charrette, shortly thereafter, to begin to understand that. All of that begins with a facility needs assessment. I would call that a program. That's what architects need in order to begin to design. That is a good understanding of what it is that you're trying to get done that translates the usage or the description of that usage into square footage. And that eventually is going to lead to understanding what the adjacencies of those different needs are going to be. So diagrams can be formed so that helps people understand that. When you're putting the building committee, be careful to make sure that you're paying attention to bringing some diversity of opinion onto this committee. Don't just fill it out. As Matt said, it's tempting to fill it out with the people that think like you do. That's a danger, because somewhere along the line, somebody's going to introduce an opposing point of view, and it is helpful to be able to hear that in the early stages of the process. And a good building committee ought not to be afraid to bring these things up. Bringing people of different ages is important. So experience is important, but less experienced people can also have valuable gifts and skills. And I tell people this all the time. When you come on, there may be a real estate agent there who actually knows and cares something about design, or has been to a location where they saw something that made sense that applies to them. Don't discourage them from holding back. In other words, don't restrict the real estate agent to talk about land. Don't restrict the contractor or the subcontractor to talk about installation of piping across the land. Let people open up and talk outside their areas of expertise. They say that in a building committee meeting, there are no dumb ideas. There are tons of dumb ideas. I've been through charrettes before where some of the craziest, wackiest stuff has come up. I've come up with some of it, by the way, right? So allow people to express themselves. Allow them to work it out. Lead them through that process, but allow people the freedom to be able to talk. Ironically, I've found that contractors actually have a pretty good sense of design. I can't believe as an architect I'm actually saying that out loud, but contractors have a pretty good sense of design. They're around design all the time in various situations. They're around architects, some of whom can be the most irritating people they've ever had to work with, but they get an appreciation. Some of them went into construction because they actually wanted to be designers. I've worked with a lot of contractors who have degrees in architecture, but decided to go into building instead of actual design. So allowing people who are on the building committee to talk outside their area of expertise is really helpful, really important, really freeing. And I think good things can come out of those kinds of discussions, even if ideas are expressed and then set to the sidelines. That's okay. Now, if somebody's dominating the discussion with all kinds of crazy ideas, eventually you have to sort of temper that a little bit. But nevertheless, it is important to allow people the freedom to come and express themselves. And bring in some younger people. I would say that it's tempting to fill out your committee with the people who are older in your congregation or older on in your organization, who maybe have financial wherewithal, who have common sense from having been through the war a couple of times. But younger people can bring energy. And younger people think differently about the whole notion of community. And so when we start talking about how to use a building as a community center, younger people do bring a different perspective, and it's important to allow them to express themselves in the context, even though they may not be the ones that are filling out the major portion of the budget for a project. They are energizing. They're energizing, by the way, for an architect in their office. You're going to see some people that we have on video from our office at BGW. These are people that I have learned from, people that were interning under me, when they came into the office, they knew nothing. I would explain something to them, and I would get the deer in the headlights look. They knew nothing about anything. But over time, I was learning from them as well a different way to think about space, a different way to think about the organization of massing for a building, a different way to think about color. That's important to allow those kinds of attitudes and opinions forward in your process as well, as it is for an architect in their studio. Crucially important. People that are going to be deeply committed. So when you ask somebody to be on the building committee, don't sugarcoat it for them. If you don't know, let's talk about it. Ask them if they would pray about it, that they would feel called to it. And when they say, well, how much time commitment? If you don't know as the chairman of the building committee, ask me and I will give you a layout of how the building committee participates along the way so that we can give them an accurate portrayal of what their responsibilities are going to be and what their time commitments are going to be. The time committed during a charette, I'm doing a charette this week right here in town, and there are 3 consecutive night meetings, 3 hours per night. That's a major time commitment for a young mom who has got 3 kids trying to get their homework done at home. Well, maybe for the dad who's stuck at home trying to figure out their homework with them, but that's a intensive week. Let's make sure that they understand what's happening there. People who will participate, who will not just sit quietly and allow things to pass, waiting for their opportunity to talk about the 1 or 2 things that they happen to know about. So people who will participate in the discussion without dominating the discussion. That betrays a sense of collaboration, an understanding about how to collaborate with working well with one another, as the 3rd bullet item talks about here, is somebody who can participate in the context of a larger discussion and bring compromise and peace. Every project that we work on has compromises that need to be made. And it's important for the building committee to hear what those needs are and then to decipher where do we begin to find solutions that we can use space in flexible ways. How can we find compromises along the way? How do we not bury one of the important ministries of our church? So that discussion can sometimes be complex, and having people who are willing to participate in that discussion is crucial, and who are open-minded towards different ways of getting things done. I was doing one in Northwest Arkansas recently, and somebody came in with a book of photographs of things that they liked in church design, very similar to a person who wants to build a house, and they start snipping things out of a magazine, and they come in and they put 40 different things on the table and say, here's all the things we want in the house. And the mind of the architect is spinning. Well, this particular person had a very, very rigid idea of what their portrayal of what a church aesthetically ought to look like. The old Midwestern, very vertical, white clapboard building. Beautiful buildings. You've seen them, some of them out on the prairie when you're driving across the prairie. Beautiful. The rest of the building committee was not on board. And so we had to go through quite a bit of discussion, and I had to hand it to this individual the way that they came around to identifying what parts of this can we incorporate, what parts do I need to let go of in order to accomplish some of the things that I think are beautiful. Now, this person also happened to be an individual who was going to put a major amount of the funding down on the project. So they came in thinking, this is it, this is what we're doing, but they walked out thinking, okay, I've heard from the other people, and here are some of the compromises that we need to make in order to accommodate the opinions of some of the other individuals that I hadn't considered. Now, that was an individual that actually participated at a high level for a building committee and didn't begrudge everybody to say, listen, if you're not going to do it my way, I'm going to take my ball and go home. So that was an important step in that individual's life to be able to do that. Make sure that you have a linkage to leadership. Don't send the building committee off on their task and allow them to float. Don't just turn them loose. They will need to come back and check in and work through things because there are going to be decisions along the way that are going to affect. And if you go out there for an extended period of time without checking back, you run the risk of not being on board with where leadership finds out that you're headed on things. So all of this comes back to a 3-day charette process. How many of you have participated in a design charette? Anybody? How many of you know what the word charette means? Have you heard that word? No? Okay. Before I talk about a charette, I'm going to tell you what the word charette means. Charette is the French word for little chariot. And back in the 1700s, in the Beaux-Arts School of Design in Paris, France, the first place that architects were trained in mass, they would roll this little cart that would come through the design studio. There'd be a room like this filled with people who were designing their little hearts away, and the cart would roll in at 5 o'clock, and if your drawings were not on the cart, rolled up with your name on them, by the time it exited the door over here, you received a failing grade. So to an architect, to a designer, the charette process is a time-intensive process that requires you to make decisions. And that process, we're going to dive into the depths of that a little bit in our next session to understand some of the characteristics of a design charette, what it can bring to an organization, how it can evolve a design very rapidly to get you to a point where you can accomplish your next stages and so forth.